My name is Tobias Sturt. I'm the creative director of an agency called Add2. We're an information design agency. I also teach data visualization and information design, particularly communication. Storytelling. I've called it data visual storytelling here. Is it storytelling with data visualization? Is it visual storytelling with data? Possibly all of these, certainly some of them. So this is what I'm going to talk about this morning. This is going to be a very mini masterclass, but I'm going to try and cover the basics and really start with the basics with what a story is. This is a lazy start, isn't it? Dictionary definition. But I'm going at speed. Work with me here. An account of imaginary or real people and events told for entertainment. Here's an example of this done visually. This is not data visualization. Well, it's qualitative data visualization, maybe. This is Bacchus and Ariadne on Naxos, a painting by the great Venetian Renaissance master Titian, and it's brilliant. Like, Titian was a genius, right? This is full of color and motion and emotion and feeling. But it's also a brilliant piece of visual storytelling. This is the story of Ariadne, Princess of Crete. She has been abandoned on the island of Naxos by the Greek hero Theseus, because he was an arsehole, like most Greek heroes. But she has been discovered by the god Bacchus, who has fallen in love with her. And actually, quite rarely for Greek myth, this ends quite well. Bacchus marries her, raises her. In some versions, he raises her up to Olympus. In other versions, after she dies, he places her in the Pleiades, the seven sisters, in the constellation. She becomes a star. So Titian is telling this story, and he's telling it really well, right? This is a lovely piece of work. It definitely fits that bit of our definition. It's entertaining. Now, this is the bit, of course, that can, it is full of drama. And that drama is coming from the emotion. He's captured the emotion of Ariadne. She's been abandoned by Theseus. She's all alone, and then this god arrives. It's this really heightened moment, and he's put it into her movement, that turn, where she sees Bacchus, and Bacchus, overcome by Ariadne, leaping from his chariot in this massive movement. Titian is making that emotion dramatic. Here's another version of this event. This is a Victorian painting. I don't know who did this. It's terrible. And look how boring it is. Ariadne is going, whatever. It's so dull. Whereas Titian is absolutely packing this full of feeling. And this is where the drama comes from. This is how we engage an audience with that emotion. Now, obviously, when we're talking about data, this can feel really alien because data is fact. We're not supposed to be emotional. This is rational. But when you look at the data, you feel emotions. You see something that's surprising, that's shocking, or that's gratifying. That's exactly what I predicted. And yes, now obviously, once you start analyzing the data, you're going to try and be as rational and dispassionate as possible. As my colleague Adam, our content director, always says, if you're doing data analysis and you're not bored, you haven't finished. It's supposed to be boring because you've got to be rigorous. You've got to dismiss all the biases. But when you come to communicate it, you're going to want to put that emotion back in. The emotion you felt is what you want your audience to feel. So if you've got a fact like the world's 10 richest people are worth $500 billion, true. Well, that's, it's a big fact. But what does that mean? I can't really conceive of how much money $500 billion is. I have trouble with a billion. These are just numbers. But put that into its context. The world's 10 richest people are worth more than the poorest 50%. Now this is packed with emotion. Now I hope you're angry and you want to do something about this because this is wrong. I used to work for The Guardian, by the way. This has a meaning. And this is what we want to do with our data. And it usually is this act of putting it back in its context, the context that made you interested and surprised. That's what you want to get to with your audience. The reason why this works so well in Titian's painting is because he's thought really carefully about the moment he's dramatizing. He's picked one moment from the story of Ariadne, because it's a complicated story. Here's another Renaissance version of it. Here's the hero Theseus, it's sort of comic strip thing. Theseus arrives on Crete, charms Ariadne. She lets him into the labyrinth. He kills the Minotaur, her half-brother, Asterion. And then they flee together off to the ships and off they sail. There's so much going on here. It's insane. You kind of need to know the myth before you can understand any of this. Whereas Titian, this is why Titian's a genius, picks one moment, and it's that core moment of the emotion where everything's happening. You know, Ariadne's been abandoned by this man that she betrayed her country for, helped him kill her half-brother. She's been left alone on a desert island surrounded by animals, and worse, the Bacchantes, the followers of Bacchus, famed for their violence and madness. And in that moment, she is saved by a god. Like, it's this incredible, it's the peak moment of the story. And so Titian has chosen it. And this is a really key part of all storytelling, selection, picking the moment you want to communicate. This is particularly hard in data visualization because, you know, we got a lot of stuff. There's a lot of information to communicate. Here's all of Titian's works, charted all the different genres, how much he was doing in any particular year or how much was released in any particular year. There's a huge amount of stuff here. And it's just overwhelming. And actually, as I think it was Helen was saying earlier, you know, stripping that back and saying something simple, delivering your key message, is so much more powerful because it's so much easier to take in. There's less stuff. It's easier to start looking. And the great thing of making it easier for your audience to start looking is you can keep them looking. Now we can start to introduce some complexity and start talking about, you know, how you can see here when Titian started being employed by Philip II here, having to paint lots of royal portraits. Religious art, of course, and Renaissance all the time. Mythological painting, he gets more interested as he gets older. Like, you start to see that detail. But because we made it easy to step into the story and start reading. But this takes us to probably the most important part of all storytelling. This word. This is the most important one. An account. It is no mistake that in English we use the same word for telling stories as we do for adding up numbers. Accounting. Putting things into order. Structuring things. That is all a story is. Facts in a structure. And that structuring is the key part of any storytelling. What we might call emphasis, putting things into an order, saying this is most important, this is second, this is third. Showing your audience how to read. And Titian is doing this in spades. Now, he's including lots of stuff. It's not just this one moment. We've got a lot of stuff in here. Over here, for example, this is Theseus' ship sailing away. So he's got, you know, what has just happened in there. He's got the future in there. We've got the Pleiades right at the top, the stars where Ariadne is going to end up. But he's emphasizing this one moment out of the whole story. He's making us concentrate on this moment. But even in this moment, he's introducing emphasis. Look at it, Bacchus and Ariadne there. They get a whole half of the canvas to themselves. Half of the painting is just two people and blank space. Blue sky and blue sea. And against that, the pink and rose flesh tones, Bacchus's rose cloak, Ariadne's red sash, those color contrasts, red and blue, two parts of a triad. So a third of the way around the color wheel from each other. So they contrast and they stand out and they make us notice these characters most of all, which is what Titian wants us to see. He wants us to concentrate on this core part of his story. What he's using is a technique that gets called figure and ground, contrasting one element against a generic background. And the key thing there is that contrast, that really obvious difference between one element and the rest. What Titian is using here is contrast in color. Drawing out that, as I said, there's two parts of a triad, red and blue. And color is just one of a whole range of what are called pre-attentively processed visual attributes. I'm all right, I'm among academics, I can use terms like that. Attributes of visuals that our brain processes before we are actively paying attention. So it's the stuff that enters your brain unconsciously, changes in position, orientation, the angle of something, size and area, shape, color, value, which is the visual density of an element, and pattern or texture. It doesn't take any conscious thought for you to notice that one block in these grids is different to the others. It was stuff that you just took in instinctively. And by making contrast then in these really simple visual elements, we can create visual structures. We can make people notice things. We draw, for example, a line directly, vertically along the canvas here, halfway up. You can see that pretty much everyone's head is on this line. All these main heads down here, not Silenus at the back there asleep on his ass, but everyone else neatly lined up, apart from Bacchus, raised above it, as he should be. He's a god. Of course he should be raised up. But if he was down here among everyone else, he just kind of melds into the melee. You don't see him. Likewise, I talked about color. Titian is known as the master of color, and this cloak is a beautiful piece of work. Look at the highlights on it. You can see that it's satin. It's glowing in the sun. But it's this really important rose color. It stands out against that blue sky. If it was blue, he disappears again. He stops being so noticeable. Titian is using these changes in these pre-attentively processed visual attributes to direct our attention, to say, look here, look at these points. These are the key things to be seeing. So all of these incredibly useful in creating the structures that make our visual stories. But three of them are more useful than the others. And that is position, orientation, and size. And they're more useful for us because we can measure these differences. I can take out a ruler and measure how much higher up that top square is than the others, measure the angle of that orientation, calculate the area of that square. I can represent these changes in numbers. And that means I can use these changes to represent numbers. I can use them to make charts, and that's all charts are. They are manipulations of these pre-attentively processed visual attributes. Now, a bar chart is just about position. I have a horizontal axis, and I'm marking my data against it, and then the size of the bar helps emphasize those differences and communicates the structure of the data unconsciously because it is using this pre-attentively processed visual attributes. You know, a pie chart, again, the size of the segment emphasizes the data, but actually it's the angle where the data is. So it's that orientation. Whereas for a line chart, the data is in a position. Again, we're marking against an axis, vertical axis. We're marking our data points. But then the orientation of the line emphasizes the difference between those data points. The steeper the line, the more dramatic the difference. So all of them using some combination of these basic pre-attentively processed visual attributes. And this is why data visualization is so effective, because so much of it happens unconsciously. We look at these shapes and we take in a huge amount of information, completely unawares. Gives us an ability to sneak numbers into our audience's heads before they even know they're looking at numbers. And this really matters because what it does is give our audience this instinctive sense of the shape of the data set, which is going to help them explore it in detail. And once they start reading the numbers, understanding what they mean, they have this context. But it's also going to guide where they look. You know, that first glance is going to make you see this peak. In about 1515, when Titian finished his apprenticeship, moved back to Venice, and you're going to start wondering what he was doing in that year, why it was important. And here is where we really hit the nub in terms of visual storytelling with data. So this is an example chart from one of my very favorite bits of data viz research. This is from a paper called Bars and Lines by Barbara Tversky and Jeff Sachs. And I recommend it. It's a great read. And I recommend it particularly because it confirms everything I already thought, just gave me the evidence to prove it. Confirmation bias is a hell of a drug. And this is great. This is just one experiment they did, but it's a really good example. So they took a really simple data set, average heights of 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and they charted it in two different ways, as a column chart and as a line chart. And then they showed each chart to a different audience and asked those audiences, what can you tell us about this data? What insights do you derive from these charts? Here is where it gets interesting. Because the audience that saw the column chart said, well, on average, 12-year-olds are taller than 10-year-olds. Which is true, right? And it's right there. This column is taller than that column. But the audience that saw the line chart said children get taller as they get older, which is also true. And it is also right there in the chart. The line goes up and to the right. Both insights are true. You can arrive at either insight through either chart by engaging your analytical thought and thinking about what the data meant. What matters is how those visuals framed the interpretation. Because a column chart separates out the data points, base aligns them, and asks us to judge who's taller, who's shorter, who's ahead, who's behind, who's winning, who's losing. It frames it as an act of comparison, competition. Whereas a line chart, each data point comes from the previous, goes to the next. It traces a process of change across the page and through time. The sad fact is, there is no such thing as objective data visualization. The moment you start charting, you start telling stories. You have no choice. Your audience will interpret charts depending on the visual language you use. They will see a bar chart as an act of comparison. They will see a line chart as an act of change. They will see a pie chart, a circle. This picture of divinity, of wholeness, divided up into its constituent parts. It tells a story of composition. It has flaws. I realize pie charts aren't great. They can't show much data. This one's already broken. But for telling that story of composition, they are unrivaled. So we need to be thinking, as we pick charts, we need to be thinking about what is the story in our data? What is it we want our audience to see? How do we need to frame the audience's understanding of this data in the right way? But then we need to start thinking about all the other things that we need to do, not just showing them the data, but how we're going to walk them into the detail. And this is where all of Titian's tricks come into play. Because he does such a fantastic job of walking us into the detail of this story, making sure that we can see where to start. Bacchus, isn't that just obvious? He's big, he's in this dramatic pose. So the orientation, the size, the color, the position, all these things emphasizing that we start with Bacchus. And then there's changes in color and texture. So it's blank canvas. These two figures make us see Ariadne and see the core part of the story. And that means that Titian can include all this other stuff. This amazing stuff, a guy wrestling with snakes without distracting us. But all that detail's still there, and we can get to it later. We can get to, finally, my favorite bit of this whole painting, this little guy. This little fawn who's dragging along a calf's head as a toy and looking straight out at us. If you want to go and look at this, it's just down the road in the National Gallery. And the way it's hung, this guy's just about at eye level. And it's the most extraordinary experience. He's looking straight out at you. He's found, I don't know what he means. It's just this weird little detail. So this extra little, it's the sources footnote. It's this little bit, see this paper at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. But we're going to get there because Titian has structured this story so carefully. And that's what I want to emphasize most of all. We do have to think about our charting, how well our charting worked, but communicating effectively with data storytelling is all about that visual structure, making sure your audience can see how to read, where to go, always consciously thinking about how we are using those pre-attentively processed visual attributes to guide our audience. And one last thing, because listening to everybody talking about collaboration, I should say, like, Tishan's a genius. This stuff is hard. Now, I'm the creative director, and I mentioned Adam earlier, the content director. There's always at least 2 of us on a project, because I need his brain too. You know, it takes at least 2 of us. There's usually also a designer. There's quite often a statistician. You know, you're starting to build a team, and at the very least, you know, if you are looking to talk to people with data, checking what you're making with an audience, checking what you're making with your colleagues, making sure that it is working is vital. That collaboration is at the heart of everything we do. Actually, you know, Tishan had a studio too. It's not a shameful thing to be doing. So, I encourage you all at lunchtime to go down St. Martin's Lane and go and have a look at this. It's brilliant. And thank you very much.